The groan of the final moving box scraping across the oak floorboards was the sound of our new life beginning. I set it down, the cardboard sighing under the weight of books and old photo albums, and wiped a slick of sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. Through the wavy, antique glass of the living room window, the Blue Ridge Mountains were a hazy, silent testament to our decision. They rose up around us, ancient and immense, their peaks lost in the low-hanging afternoon clouds. This was it. 200 acres of North Carolina wilderness, a 2-story farmhouse built when Teddy Roosevelt was president, and not a single soul within shouting distance. It was everything I'd dreamed of during those endless soul-crushing years designing HVAC systems for Charlotte's soulless corporate high-rises. "What do you think, champ?" I asked, turning to my son. Leo, all of 8 years old and swallowed by a red t-shirt, didn't answer. He stood by the front door, his small hand pressed flat against the cool glass of a window pane, staring out at the wall of hickory and tulip poplars that bordered our new front lawn. His silence was a common language for him, but this felt different, deeper. "David, it's solid," Sarah said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty room. She ran a hand along the stone of the massive fireplace that dominated the wall. "The bones are good." She was right. The house was a fortress. Chestnut beams, thick as my thigh, fieldstone foundation, floors that barely creaked. It had been neglected, sure. The paint was peeling in long, sun-bleached strips, and a generation of dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the grime on the windows. But it was ours. Every last penny of our savings, a significant chunk of my 401k, all poured into a property we'd bought for a price that had made our realtor raise a skeptical eyebrow. A place like this much land? Either the owner's desperate or there's a catch, he'd warned. I just smiled, convinced I'd found the deal of a lifetime. The catch so far seemed to be the quiet. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the countryside I'd imagined. It was a heavy, pressing silence. I'd grown up with the drone of cicadas, the call of whippoorwills, the chirping of crickets. Here there was nothing, just the rustle of a million leaves in the wind, a sound like a slow, deep exhalation. No birdsong, no squirrels chattering in the ancient oaks. The woods watched, and they didn't make a sound. "We're almost out of milk," Sarah announced later, pulling her head out of the ancient, humming refrigerator. "And I think Leo needs a break from unpacking. Let's make a run into town. See what civilization looks like around here." The town, a 20-minute drive down a winding mountain road, was a place called Hemlock Creek. It was little more than a wide spot in the road with a post office, a gas station with a single rusty pump, and a general store that smelled of sawdust and old coffee. "Miller's Mercantile," read the faded sign swinging in the breeze. Inside, a bell tinkled. The place was a time capsule. Shelves were crammed with everything from canned beans and fishing lures to work gloves and motor oil. Behind a scarred wooden counter stood a man who looked as old as the mountains themselves. His face was a road map of wrinkles, and a faded flannel shirt hung loosely on his bony frame. A name tag pinned to his suspenders read Hank. "Afternoon," he grunted, not looking up from the newspaper spread before him. "Hi," Sarah said, her city-bred warmth a stark contrast to the store's musty air. "We just moved in up at the old Martin place." Hank's head snapped up. His eyes, the color of washed-out denim, narrowed. He slowly folded his newspaper, his movements deliberate, as if a great weight had just settled on his shoulders. He looked from Sarah to me, then his gaze lingered on Leo, who was hiding behind my leg. "The Martin place," he repeated. It wasn't a question. He let the words hang in the air. He scanned our cart: milk, bread, eggs, a box of sugary cereal for Leo. The basics of a family starting over. I saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of what looked unnervingly like pity. As I swiped my card, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "You folks be careful up there." He paused, glancing around the empty store. "That land, it's got an appetite." I forced a laugh. "Don't worry, I'm planning on putting in a big garden. We'll keep it well fed." Hank didn't smile. He just stared at me, his gaze unwavering, until I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. As we left, the bell tinkling behind us, I noticed two other customers by the coolers, a woman in a floral dress and a man in greasy overalls, who had been pretending not to listen. They were watching us, their faces grim and unreadable. They looked at us the way you look at people standing too close to a crumbling cliff edge. That night, after a dinner of takeout pizza eaten on the floor, we got Leo settled into his new room. The house cooled quickly as the sun dipped below the mountain ridge, plunging our little valley into a deep, inky blackness. Sarah and I lay in our bed, the unfamiliar shapes of the room slowly taking form in the moonlight. We were exhausted but filled with the nervous energy of new beginnings. "He was a character, wasn't he?" Sarah murmured, her head on my chest. "That man at the store. Just old-fashioned mountain charm, I guess," I said, though the man's words echoed in my head. "It's got an appetite." I was just drifting off when I heard it. A low, resonant hum. It wasn't the refrigerator or the wind. It felt deeper, older. It seemed to vibrate up through the floor, through the very frame of the bed. A bass note so low it was felt more than heard. It was the sound of something immense and ancient, shifting in its sleep deep within the earth beneath us. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her body tense against mine. "Probably just the well pump kicking on," I lied, my own heart starting to beat a little faster. "Or the water pipes in the walls. This house is 100 years old." She accepted it, but I could feel she didn't believe it. I didn't believe it either. The sound went on for almost an hour, a deep, foundational thrum that seemed to make the oppressive silence outside feel even heavier. Later, just before dawn, a small cry from down the hall jolted us awake. It was Leo. "I had a bad dream," he whimpered when I reached his room, his small body trembling under the covers. I sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his back until his breathing evened out. I told him it was just a new house, new sounds. But as I sat there in the dark, listening to the unsettling silence that had replaced the hum, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house and the land it sat on was dreaming too. And its dreams were not pleasant. The unsettling quiet of the land began to seep into our family, poisoning the fresh start we'd so desperately wanted. The change was most pronounced in Leo. My son, who had once filled our cramped Charlotte apartment with the sounds of plastic dinosaurs battling and imaginary spaceships landing, had fallen silent. He abandoned his box of toys in the corner of his room, the colorful plastic gathering a thin film of dust. His new world was the window. For hours he would sit on the floor, his knees drawn up to his chest, and simply stare into the dense, unblinking woods. He looked like a prisoner studying the wall of his cell, searching for an escape that wasn't there. His anxiety became a palpable presence in the house. He'd jump at the sound of a floorboard creaking upstairs or the rattle of a loose window pane in the wind. At night, the bad dreams became a nightly ritual. It was never a vague fear of monsters under the bed. It was always the same, terrifyingly specific nightmare. "He was there again," he'd sob, clutching my shirt when I came to comfort him. "Outside my window." "Who, buddy? Who was there?" His voice would drop to a terrified whisper. "The tall, skinny man." With the dead wolf's head, he'd burrow his face into my shoulder, his small body racked with shivers. "He knows my name, Dad." He keeps whispering it. I told him it was a dream. Just a silly nightmare brought on by the move. But the consistency of it gnawed at me. A wolf's head? It was such a bizarre, specific image. I'd walk over to his window and look out into the impenetrable blackness of the yard, my skin crawling. The moon would cast long, skeletal shadows from the trees, and for a terrifying second, I could almost imagine a tall, gaunt figure standing just at the edge of the light, watching us, waiting. Sarah bore the brunt of it. She was the one who spent her days with Leo's deepening silence, who saw the vibrant light in his eyes dim a little more each day. About a week after the nightmares started, she found his sketchbook. She brought it to me in the kitchen where I was wrestling with a leaky faucet under the sink. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she held out the worn, spiral-bound book. "David, you need to see this," she said, her voice tight with a fear I hadn't heard since the car accident we'd had years ago. I pulled myself out from under the sink, wiping grease from my hands onto a rag. "What is it?" She opened the sketchbook. The first few pages were filled with Leo's usual drawings. Brightly colored superheroes, clumsy-looking cars, a wobbly portrait of the three of us with giant, smiling heads. Then, the drawings changed. The color vanished, replaced by the frantic dark strokes of a graphite pencil. Page after page was filled with the same horrifying figure. It was the creature from his nightmares. A tall, emaciated human-like body with arms and legs stretched to impossible insect-like lengths. Its skin, rendered with heavy, overlapping lines, looked gray and tight, stretched thin over a rack of ribs. But the head was the most grotesque part. It was a long, narrow wolf skull, perfectly detailed with hollow black pits for eyes and a permanent snarl of jagged teeth. Sarah flipped through the pages. In one drawing, the creature stood among the trees, its long, spindly fingers wrapped around the trunk of an oak. In another, it was crouched low to the ground, its wolf skull tilted as if listening. The perspective was always from the house, as if Leo was drawing exactly what he saw from his window. The final drawing made my blood run cold. It depicted our house, small and vulnerable. And standing over it, impossibly tall, was the creature. It was leaning down, one skeletal three-fingered hand reaching out, its fingertips just inches from touching Leo's bedroom window. Underneath, in Leo's shaky, childish script, were two words: "He's close." "My God," I breathed, the sketchbook feeling heavy and profane in my hands. "This isn't normal, David." Sarah's voice cracked. "This is more than stress. There's something wrong here. Something wrong with this place. We need to take him to see someone. A child psychologist, a therapist, I don't care. We need to help him." A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach, but my own stubborn pragmatism rose to fight it. We couldn't afford a psychologist. We couldn't afford anything. We had sunk every dollar, every dream into this land. Admitting something was wrong with the house felt like admitting I had failed them, that I had led my family into a nightmare of my own making. "Honey, let's not overreact," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, hating how weak it sounded. He's a creative kid with a big imagination. We moved him away from his friends, stuck him in the middle of nowhere. He's just processing it. Drawing is how he works things out. Works things out? She cried, snatching the book back from me. Look at this. Does this look like working things out to you? He's terrified. He's not sleeping. He's barely eating. That old man in the store? He knew. He knew something was wrong with this property. He's a superstitious old man in a backwater town, I countered, my defensiveness rising. People like that have stories for every rock and tree. It doesn't mean they're real. And the hum we heard, and the nightmares? Is that just a story too? She demanded, her eyes welling with tears of frustration and fear. I pulled her into a hug, her body stiff and resistant in my arms. Look, just give it a little more time, I pleaded, stroking her hair. Let's get the house finished. Let's make it feel like a home. Once we're settled, once things feel normal again, the nightmares will stop. I promise. I was promising her, but I was also trying to convince myself. As I held her, my eyes drifted to the window over the kitchen sink. The sun was setting and the woods were turning into a solid mass of black. I stared into the darkness, a horrifying thought taking root in my mind. What if Leo wasn't drawing a nightmare? What if he was drawing a portrait? The argument with Sarah left a sour taste in the air for days. I threw myself into the physical labor of renovating the house, hoping the sweat and exhaustion would silence the growing dread in my own mind. I told myself that every repaired floorboard, every fresh coat of paint, was a step toward normalcy, a brick in the wall I was building against my family's fears. My final frontier was the basement. It was a classic Appalachian cellar, dug out of the red Carolina clay and lined with rough gray fieldstone. A single bare bulb hung from a rafter, casting a web of distorted shadows that danced every time I moved. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, a faint cloying scent of decay, like old, forgotten meat. I'd been putting it off, but the persistent dampness was starting to affect the floorboards above, and my pragmatic side knew it had to be dealt with. I spent the morning clearing out the detritus of the previous owners. Stacks of yellowed newspapers from the 1970s, mason jars filled with a black unidentifiable sludge, and a collection of rusted farm implements. Behind a set of rickety wooden shelves laden with empty paint cans, I saw it. A section of the stone wall, about 6 feet wide and 8 feet high, was different. The rest of the foundation was built from large, irregular stones fitted together like a puzzle. This section was made of smaller, flatter rocks, and the mortar was a different color, lighter and sandier than the dark, crumbling cement around it. My engineer's brain kicked in. It was a patch. A repair, maybe. But why would you need to repair a whole section of a fieldstone foundation? Curious, I balled my fist and rapped my knuckles against it. The other walls answered with a dull, solid thud. This section gave back a hollow boom. There was a space behind it. A jolt of adrenaline, part curiosity and part something darker, shot through me. I went back upstairs to my toolbox and came back with a 3-pound sledgehammer and a long steel pry bar. I wedged the tip of the pry bar into a crack in the mortar and slammed the back of it with the hammer. The impact echoed in the small space, and a puff of dry, stale-smelling dust exploded from the wall. I worked for the better part of an hour, sweat stinging my eyes, the rhythmic clang of steel on steel the only sound. The mortar was stubborn, but piece by piece, stone by stone, the wall came apart. Finally, with a loud crack, a large section gave way, tumbling inwards and crashing to the floor on the other side. I peered through the jagged opening I'd created. It wasn't a room but a short, narrow corridor, maybe 10 feet long, ending in a wall of dark, rusted metal. My heart hammered against my ribs. This made no sense. I spent another 30 minutes widening the hole until I could squeeze through. I stood up, my boots crunching on fallen mortar, and shone my flashlight down the corridor. The air here was even colder, and the smell of rot was overpowering. The corridor was as crudely built as the rest of the basement, but the thing at the end of it was utterly alien to this old farmhouse. It was a door, a solid steel door, the kind you'd see on a bank vault or a commercial freezer. It was set in a heavy steel frame bolted directly into the rock. 4 thick industrial-grade deadbolts were thrown across it, their sliding mechanisms caked in rust. But the strangest, most chilling detail was that on my side, there was no handle, no knob, no lever, no way to open it from the outside. This door was designed with only one purpose: to keep whatever was on the other side from getting out. A wave of vertigo washed over me. Who would put something like this in the basement of a farmhouse? Why would you seal it behind a stone wall? My mind reeled, trying to find a logical explanation. A root cellar? A storm shelter? None of it fit. This was a cage. A tomb. As I backed away from the imposing metal slab, the beam of my flashlight caught something near the ceiling of the main basement area just outside the hole I'd made. My eyes traced the object, and a fresh wave of ice-cold fear washed over me. Mounted on a rusty bracket was an old surveillance camera. It was a bulky, cylindrical model from the 80s, its glass eye coated in a thick layer of dust. It was pointed directly at the hole in the wall, directly at the steel door behind it. A thick black cable snaked from the back of the camera, running along the ceiling joists to a dark corner of the basement. I followed the cable, my flashlight beam trembling. It ended at a small makeshift shelf wedged between 2 of the house's main support beams. And sitting on that shelf, half covered in a shroud of cobwebs, was a VCR. The cable from the camera was plugged neatly into the video in port on the back. A thick layer of dust covered the machine, but I could just make out a single black cassette tape still sitting inside the loading bay. I stood there in the damp, cold silence of the basement, the sledgehammer hanging limply in my hand. The house suddenly felt immense and threatening, a crypt holding secrets I was never meant to find. The pragmatic engineer in me was screaming that there had to be a rational explanation. But another, more primal part of my mind knew better. Someone had gone to tremendous lengths to seal something away down here. And then they had set up a camera. Not to see what was coming in, but to watch and wait for what might one day get out. My hand shook as I worked. I found a small, portable black and white television in a box of old electronics I'd stored in the basement. A relic from my college dorm room. After blowing a decade's worth of dust from the VCR's vents, I plugged it in. A small red light flickered to life on the machine's front panel. It still worked. With a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic drumming in my chest, I connected the television and pressed the eject button. The tape slid out with a tired mechanical groan. A small white label was stuck to its spine. On it, written in faded blue ink, were 2 words: Day 29. I slid the tape back in and pressed play. The television screen erupted in a blizzard of static before resolving into a grainy, flickering image. The camera's vantage point was fixed, showing the section of stone wall I had just demolished. It was a ghost image of my own recent labor. The date and time stamp in the corner of the screen was glitchy and unreadable, but the scene was clear enough. 3 people stood before the sealed wall: a man, a woman, and a boy who looked to be in his late teens. They were gaunt, their clothes hanging off their thin frames. Their faces were pale and smudged with dirt. their eyes wide with a sleepless, animal terror. The Martins. This was the family that had lived here before us. They weren't just standing there. They were performing some kind of desperate, frantic ritual. The man, presumably Mr. Martin, was on his knees, pouring a thick line of what looked like salt on the stone floor, tracing a complex circular pattern around the area in front of the hidden door. The woman held a thick, leather-bound book, her lips moving as she read from it, though no sound came from the television's tiny speaker. The teenage boy was lighting thick, white candles and placing them at points around the circle. Their movements were not those of devout practitioners. They were clumsy, rushed, and filled with a raw, palpable fear. They looked like people trying to defuse a bomb that was already ticking. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, for what felt like an eternity. They finished their preparations and stood together, huddled inside the circle of salt, facing the wall. Mr. Martin began chanting, his voice a silent plea on the tape. Suddenly, the single bare bulb hanging in the basement on the recording began to flicker violently. The three figures flinched in unison, their heads snapping towards the wall. They stumbled back, pressing against the far edge of their salt circle. The image on the screen wavered, distorted by lines of static. And then I saw it. The stones of the sealed wall in the video began to vibrate. Not just a faint tremor, but a visible, violent shudder, as if a colossal fist was pounding on it from the other side. The Martins were screaming now. I couldn't hear them, but I could see it in their wide-open mouths. Their bodies contorted in pure terror. The mother dropped the book. The son fell to his knees, covering his head with his hands. The screen dissolved into a waterfall of static, a high-pitched whine emitting from the TV. My heart seized in my chest. I wanted to turn it off, to run, but I was frozen, my eyes glued to the screen. The static cleared as abruptly as it had begun. The Martin family was gone. The salt circle was broken, its white lines scuffed and scattered. The candles were extinguished. For a breathtaking second, I thought the room was empty. Then, my eyes adjusted. Standing in the very center of the frame, where the terrified family had just been, was a figure. It was him. The creature from Leo's drawings. It was tall, so tall its head was nearly out of the frame. Its limbs were unnaturally long and thin, bent at odd angles. Its body was a thing of stretched gray skin and protruding bone. And its head was the bleached, elongated skull of a wolf, the eye sockets two pits of absolute darkness. It was more real, more solid than I could ever have imagined. The tape quality was poor, but there was no mistaking it. It was not a man in a costume. It was a violation of nature. The creature stood perfectly still for a moment, as if acclimating itself. Then, very slowly, with a fluid, unnatural grace, it turned its wolf skull head. It tilted its head down, and its empty socket seemed to zero in on the camera lens. It stared right into the camera. Right through the camera, through the tape, through the 40 years that separated that moment from this one. I felt that dead, hollow gaze land on me, pinning me to the spot in my own basement. It felt like it could see me, see into me, see the terrified beating of my own heart. A wave of profound, soul-deep cold washed over me. This thing was not just a monster. It was ancient, intelligent, and it knew I was there. With a choked cry, I lunged forward and ripped the VCR's power cord from the wall socket. The screen went black, plunging the basement back into its gloomy silence. I stumbled back, my legs weak, and collapsed against the far wall, gasping for air. The image of that dead-eyed stare was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. My first impulse was to run upstairs, grab Sarah and Leo, and drive until the sun came up. But where would we go? We had nowhere else. Every cent we had was tied up in this land, this house, this tomb. A new, colder kind of pragmatism took hold. Telling Sarah would cause a panic. She would demand we leave, and she would be right, but we couldn't. I convinced myself it was a one-time event. A historical record of madness. Whatever that thing was, whatever the Martins had done, it had happened a long time ago. The wall had been built. The door was still locked. It was over. I shoved the tape back into the VCR and hid the machine and the television back in the deepest, darkest corner of the basement. I would deal with the hole in the wall tomorrow. I would seal it back up, better than before. I would plaster over it and paint it, and we would never, ever talk about it again. It was a secret I would have to keep. A terrible, heavy secret that I now shared with the Martins and with the thing that stared at me from across the decades. Sealing the wall was an act of desperate denial. I worked with a feverish intensity, mixing mortar, fitting the stones back into place one by one, trying to physically wall off the memory of what I'd seen on that tape. But the knowledge of what lay behind the stones, behind the steel door, had changed the house. It was no longer just a fixer-upper. It was a prison, and I was the unwitting warden. And now that I knew what to listen for, I heard everything. The house settled at night, not with the gentle groans of old timber, but with sharp, distinct snaps that sounded like footsteps on the floorboards directly above my head while Sarah and I lay awake in bed. I'd hold my breath, listening, but there would only be silence. Then a few minutes later, a similar sound would come from the living room downstairs. It was as if something was pacing the length of the house, testing its boundaries. Then came the scratching, a long, drawn-out scraping sound against the exterior siding. It would start at one end of the house and slowly, methodically, travel to the other. It sounded exactly like a dry branch being dragged against the wood, but there were no trees close enough to the house to make that sound. The first time I heard it, I told Sarah it was an animal, a raccoon or a possum. But in my mind, I pictured long, skeletal fingers with ragged claws, tracing the perimeter of our home. The dread became a constant, low-grade hum in the back of my mind. I was short-tempered and perpetually exhausted. Sarah watched me with worried eyes, no doubt thinking the stress of the renovation was getting to me. She didn't know the truth. I was terrified to fall asleep. About a week after I'd resealed the wall, one of those phantom footsteps from the living room woke me around 2 a.m. It was louder this time, a distinct creak of a floorboard right below our bedroom. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I crept to the top of the stairs, peering down into the moonlit darkness of the first floor. Nothing. The house was silent. I told myself I was losing my mind, that my imagination was running wild because of that damned tape. I turned to go back to bed, but a flicker of movement outside the large living room window caught my eye. I crept down the stairs, each step a carefully placed agony, and moved toward the window, staying in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. There, on the edge of the lawn, where the manicured grass met the wild, untamed darkness of the woods, a figure was standing. It was tall and unnaturally thin, a slash of black against the silvery, moon-washed landscape. It was too far away to make out details, but I didn't need to. I knew the impossible length of its limbs. I knew the shape of its head. It was him, the creature. It stood perfectly still, its posture radiating a predatory patience, and it was looking directly at the house. At me. I was paralyzed, pinned by a gaze I couldn't see but could feel like a physical pressure. The air grew cold, and the silence outside intensified, becoming a ringing in my ears. I felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. Then something new happened. A voice entered my mind. It wasn't a sound that traveled through the air and into my ears. It was a thought that wasn't my own, planted directly into my consciousness. It was a dry, rasping whisper, like the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. "I'm so hungry." The whisper was filled with a fathomless ancient starvation. It was a need that had been festering for ages. "Feed me." A guttural sob escaped my lips, and I stumbled back, away from the window, tripping over a rug and crashing to the floor. The noise broke the spell. I scrambled to my feet and looked back outside. The lawn was empty. It was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in a chair in our bedroom, watching the window until the first gray light of dawn broke over the mountains, my mind replaying that whispered command over and over. 2 nights later, I was woken not by a sound, but by Sarah's blood-curdling scream. I sat bolt upright, my heart instantly jackhammering. She was pointing a trembling finger at our bedroom window.
"There!" she shrieked, her face a mask of pure terror. "Look!"
I followed her gaze, and I saw it. Pressed up against the second-story window, impossibly tall, was the bleached white, grinning visage of the wolf skull. Its empty eye sockets were black holes staring into our room, into our lives. We were on the second floor, a good 20 feet off the ground, yet its head was level with ours. It was a grotesque, nightmarish perversion of a peeping Tom. And then we both heard it. Not just in our heads this time, but a faint, sibilant whisper that seemed to come from the glass of the window itself. A sound that vibrated through the air and chilled the very marrow in our bones. "Feed me." That was it. The last straw. The final, horrifying confirmation that broke through all my denial and my foolish pride. This thing wasn't a memory on a tape. It wasn't a bad dream. It was real, it was here, and it wanted something from us. Panic, absolute and blinding, took over. There was no more discussion, no more rationalization. We were a single unit of terror. "Get Leo," I yelled, already pulling on my jeans. "Now!" We moved in a frantic, silent frenzy. Sarah scooped a still-sleeping Leo from his bed, wrapping him in a blanket. I grabbed our wallets, her purse, the car keys. We didn't pack a thing. We fled, stumbling down the stairs and out the front door, not daring to look back. We threw ourselves into our pickup truck, the doors slamming shut with a sound that seemed pathetic against the vast, menacing silence of the mountains. I cranked the engine and peeled out of our driveway, spraying gravel. I didn't slow down until the headlights of our truck hit the paved county road, leaving the house and its monstrous sentinel swallowed by the darkness behind us. We drove, not speaking, the only sounds the roar of the engine and Leo's soft, sleepy breaths from the back seat, blissfully unaware that we had just become refugees, running for our lives from a home we owned but could never return to. 50 miles of dark, winding mountain roads later, the red neon glow of a motel sign flickered through the trees like a promise of sanctuary. "The Roanoke Rest," it proclaimed, with half the letters burnt out. It was a dingy, one-story affair, the kind of place where hope goes to die, but to us, it felt like a fortress. I paid the night clerk, a teenager who looked more interested in his phone than in our wild-eyed desperation, in cash, and we stumbled into a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. Sarah locked and bolted the door, then wedged a chair under the knob for good measure. She laid a still sleeping Leo down on one of the beds and then collapsed onto the other, curling into a tight ball. I stood by the window, peering through a crack in the grimy vinyl blinds at the empty parking lot, my body thrumming with leftover adrenaline. "What was that thing, David?" she whispered from the bed, her voice muffled by the pillow. "What in God's name was that?" "I don't know," I said, the lie feeling like sand in my mouth. I knew exactly what it was. I had seen it on the tape. I had let it out in a way by uncovering its prison. My secret was a cancer, and it was now eating my family alive. We tried to talk, to make sense of the impossible, but words failed us. How do you discuss the fact that a skeletal, wolf-headed giant is peering into your second-story window? We just sat in the humming silence of the motel room, listening to the rattle of the ancient air conditioning unit, each of us lost in our own private version of the same nightmare. Eventually, exhaustion won. We fell into a fitful, dream-haunted sleep. I was jolted awake by the shrill electronic warble of a cell phone. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. The unfamiliar room, the stale air. Then the terror of the night came rushing back. The phone was on the nightstand between the beds. It was Sarah's. She fumbled for it, her eyes still clouded with sleep. "Who would be calling at this hour?" she mumbled, squinting at the screen. The number's blocked." She answered it, putting it on speakerphone out of habit. "Hello?" Silence. A dead, empty line that seemed to stretch for miles. "Hello? Is anyone there?" she asked again, her voice gaining an edge of irritation. And then it came. Not from the phone speaker, but seemingly from the very air around us. The same dry, dead-leaf whisper. It was clearer now, closer, filled with a cold, terrifying impatience. "You can't leave." Sarah screamed and threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a sharp crack and fell to the floor. The whisper, however, lingered for a second longer, coiling in the silent room. "Feed me." I leaped from the bed and snatched the phone off the threadbare carpet. The screen was cracked, but the call was still connected. I stared at the display, and a new, more profound horror gripped me. It wasn't an unknown number. The phone's call log had registered the incoming call. The number on the screen was our own. It was the landline, from the house we had just fled. Sleep was no longer an option. We sat huddled together on one bed, watching the door as if we expected the creature to tear it from its hinges at any moment. We waited for the sun, praying for it like castaways spotting a ship on the horizon. When the first weak, gray light of dawn finally filtered through the blinds, it felt like we had survived a battle. We packed our few belongings in a numb silence. Sarah dressed Leo, who was now awake but unnervingly quiet, his eyes wide and vacant. I paid for the room and loaded the truck, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line beyond the parking lot, half expecting to see that tall, dark silhouette watching us. As I opened the passenger door for Sarah, my hand froze. There, on the cheap painted metal of our motel room door, were 3 long, deep gouges. They started near the top of the door, far higher than any person could reach, and dragged vertically downwards, tearing through the paint and deep into the metal beneath. They were fresh. The edges of the scratches shone, raw and new. My blood turned to ice. It had been here. It had found us. It had stood outside our door while we slept, its claws leaving their mark. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about the house. The house was just the anchor, the prison. But now somehow it was tied to us, to my family. We could run to the other side of the country and it wouldn't matter. It would follow. That whisper would find us. those claws would mark our doors. A terrible cold clarity settled over me. Running was futile. There was only one way to face this, and I couldn't risk it with them. I drove us to a diner and forced us all to eat. Over pancakes that tasted like cardboard, I spun a new set of lies. "Look," I began, my voice sounding artificially calm. "I think I know what's going on. The house has major wiring issues, and I think there's a gas leak from the old propane tank. It can cause hallucinations. It explains what we saw. What we heard, it was a pathetic explanation, but it was all I had." "Hallucinations don't call you on the phone, David," Sarah said, her eyes boring into me, searching for the truth I was hiding. "Faulty wiring can make phones do crazy things," I insisted. "I need to go back. Alone. I need to get it all checked out by a professional, make it safe. I want you and Leo to go to your sister's place in Tennessee. It's only a few hours from here. You'll be safe there. I'll call you as soon as I've got it all sorted out." She argued, of course. She didn't want to leave me. But she was exhausted and terrified for Leo, who hadn't said a word since we left the motel. The thought of getting him far away from that place, of being with her sister, was a powerful lure. Reluctantly, she agreed. I drove them to the freeway on-ramp, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I hugged Leo tightly, his small body feeling impossibly fragile. "I love you, buddy. Be good for your mom." He just looked at me with those haunted eyes. I kissed Sarah goodbye, a long, desperate kiss that tasted of fear and unspoken truths. "I'll fix this," I promised her. "I love you." I watched her drive away, our family car disappearing into the morning traffic, carrying the only two things in the world that mattered to me. Then I got back in my truck, turned it around, and headed back east. Back towards the mountains. Back to the house, the basement, and the monster I had to face alone. Driving back toward the house was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and follow Sarah and Leo to the safety of Tennessee. But the image of those claw marks on the motel door was burned into my mind. The creature was a predator, and my family was its prey. I had led them into its hunting ground, and I was the only one who could lead them out. The answers, I knew, were in that cold, damp basement. The house was silent and imposing when I returned. It looked different in the daylight, less haunted and more just abandoned. I walked through the empty rooms, the silence amplifying the sound of my own harsh breathing. I grabbed the heaviest flashlight I owned and descended the creaking stairs into the cellar. The hole in the wall was a gaping wound, a dark mouth leading to the steel door. I had to know more. The Martins had tried to fight this thing. They had failed, but they must have left something behind, some clue. The camera and VCR were a modern addition, but the fear that lived here was ancient. I ran my hands over the cold, rough stones of the wall surrounding the steel door, looking for anything out of place. My fingers brushed against a rock near the floor, just to the right of the door frame. It shifted, just slightly under the pressure. My heart leaped. I worked my fingers into the crack around it, pulling and wiggling until it came loose in my hand. Behind it was a small, dark cavity carved into the earth, and nestled inside was a rectangular object wrapped in oilcloth. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it. It wasn't a book, not in the traditional sense. It was a codex, a collection of thick, yellowed pages bound between two pieces of worn leather. The pages were covered in a spidery, archaic script, handwritten in faded brown ink. It was a journal. The English was old, peppered with words and phrases I barely recognized, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. It was the collective diary of the first settlers on this land, dating back to the late 1700s. They wrote of a spirit that lived in the earth, a thing of immense hunger that would rise every few generations. They called it the soil husk, or more simply, the hunger spirit. The journal detailed their terror, their dwindling numbers, and their desperate search for a way to survive. The final pages, written in a different, more modern hand, likely one of the Martins, laid out the two rituals they had discovered. The first was the rite of binding. It was a ritual of sacrifice. One human life, given willingly inside the chamber behind the steel door, would power a seal. It would feed the lock, not the beast, strengthening the prison and forcing the spirit into a deep slumber for the span of a single generation, roughly 40 years. The second was the rite of appeasement. This ritual seemed less horrific, almost merciful by comparison. It required a tribute of living flesh, livestock primarily, to be offered to the spirit over the course of 30 lunar nights. The Codex claimed this would sate the hunger and lull the spirit into a long and peaceful sleep, without the need for human sacrifice. My mind reeled. A human sacrifice. That's what the Martins had been preparing for on that tape. They were on day 29. They were one day away from what? From one of them making the ultimate sacrifice to save the others. But something went wrong. The creature manifested outside the door. I had to know what happened. Clutching the Codex, I drove back to town, my mind racing. At the Hemlock Creek County Courthouse, a bored clerk helped me search the public archives. I found the deed to the property, listing the Martin family as the owners for over a century. Then I found what I was looking for, a missing persons report, filed in 1982. The report stated that John and Mary Martin, along with their 17-year-old son, Arthur, had vanished from their farm. The official theory was that they'd simply packed up and left, abandoning the property due to financial hardship. But I kept digging. I scrolled through reels of microfiche, scanning the local newspaper from that year. And there it was. A small article, buried in the back pages, dated 2 weeks after the family was reported missing. Local boy found wandering woods. The article said that Arthur Martin, the missing son, had been found by hunters deep in the forest, miles from his home. He was suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, and a state of profound psychological shock. He was nonverbal and was subsequently committed to a state psychiatric facility. He was alive. The closest state hospital was an hour's drive away. It was a grim, imposing brick building that smelled of disinfectant and quiet desperation. I told the nurse at the front desk I was a distant relative of Arthur Martin's, a lie that slid off my tongue with unnerving ease. After a short wait, a stooped elderly orderly led me to a sunroom where a handful of patients sat staring blankly at a television. He pointed to a man sitting alone by the window. "That's Arthur." Arthur Martin was a ghost. A thin, frail man with wispy white hair and eyes that seemed to look at something far away that no one else could see. He was clutching a tattered paperback novel, his knuckles white. I sat down across from him. "Mr. Martin? My name is David Harper. I live in your old house now." There was no reaction. He continued to stare out the window. "Arthur," I said, my voice firmer. "I know about the creature. I've seen it. It's tormenting my family." His head snapped toward me. For the first time, his vacant eyes focused. They locked onto mine, and what I saw in them was not madness, but a 40-year-old terror, preserved perfectly like an insect in amber. His body began to tremble. "The house?" he rasped, his voice a dry, unused croak. You have to leave." "We can't," I said, leaning in, my voice a desperate whisper. "It's following us." I found the book. The Codex. It talks about 2 rituals. The appeasement. His eyes widened in sheer horror. He lunged forward, his frail, bony fingers gripping my arm with shocking strength. The paperback fell to the floor. "No!" he hissed, his face contorted. "It's a lie! A trick!" He pulled me closer, his breath sour, his eyes wild with a terrifying lucidity. Father. He was going to perform the binding. He was going to sacrifice himself to lock it away again, to save us. But it was too strong. It got out. It took them. His voice broke, a sob catching in his throat. It wanted us to be the food. The book. It wants you to feed it. Don't do it. He shook me, his grip frantic. Don't you understand? Feeding it doesn't make it sleep. It makes it stronger. Whatever you do, he choked out, his face inches from mine, his eyes screaming a warning across 4 decades of pain. Do not feed it. Just then, his body went rigid. A seizure took him, his limbs jerking violently. 2 orderlies rushed over, gently prying his fingers from my arm and easing him to the floor. As they tended to him, his eyes rolled back in his head, but not before he gave me one last pleading look. I backed away, my heart pounding, the old man's desperate, raspy warning echoing in my soul. I drove back to the house in a state of cold, clarity-laced panic. The puzzle pieces were slotting together, and the picture they formed was more monstrous than I could have imagined. Arthur's warning was an icy shard in my gut. Feeding it doesn't make it sleep. It makes it stronger. The rite of appeasement was a trap, a lie, written in the Codex by the entity itself, or by those who worshipped it, to trick its jailers into nourishing it, into giving it the strength to break its chains. The Martins had known. They had chosen the only real solution, the rite of binding. Sacrifice. I sat in my empty living room, the leather-bound Codex on the floor in front of me, its pages open to the 2 terrible choices. My mind was a battlefield. On one side was Arthur's frantic, sane in his insanity warning. On the other was the cold, hard fact that I was not John Martin. I was not a man who could sacrifice himself, let alone another human being, to lock a monster in a cage. The very idea was preposterous, a relic from a darker, more superstitious time. And yet, the creature was real. My phone buzzed, shattering the silence. It was Sarah. I answered, a sick feeling of dread coiling in my stomach. "David." Her voice was a ragged, hysterical sob. "David, you have to do something." "What is it? What's wrong? Are you and Leo okay?" "No. We're not okay," she cried, her voice breaking. "It's here." "I mean, it's not here, but the whispering. It won't stop. It's in my head. It's in Leo's head. We're hundreds of miles away, and it's still here." I could hear the thin, dry whisper in the background, even over the phone, a faint sibilance like a bad connection. "Leo. Oh God. David, Leo's not right," she continued, her words tumbling over each other in a torrent of fear. "He won't talk. He won't even look at me. He just lies in bed staring at the ceiling. He hasn't eaten a thing since we got here. He's just fading. And the whispering is getting louder. It's not asking anymore, David. It's demanding. A cold sweat broke out across my entire body. I could picture my son lying in a strange bed, wasting away, being tormented by a voice that was reaching out across states to claim him. The creature was starving, and it was draining the life from my family to sustain itself. Arthur's warning seemed distant now, the ravings of a traumatized old man. His entire family had been destroyed by this thing. Of course he was mad. Of course, his perspective was warped by grief and horror. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe his father had been wrong. Maybe the appeasement ritual would work. Maybe it just needed a certain kind of offering, a specific intent. It was a chance. The thought of the alternative, the rite of binding, was a door in my mind I refused to open. My choice was made. The primal, protective instinct of a father and a husband overwhelmed every other rational thought. I would not let my son waste away. I would not let my wife be driven mad. I would take the path that didn't require a human life. I would cling to the hope that Arthur Martin, broken by his trauma, had it all wrong. I had to believe the Codex offered a humane solution. "Sarah, listen to me," I said, my voice gaining a conviction born of pure desperation. "I'm going to fix this. I know what to do. Just hold on. Keep Leo safe." "I'm starting tonight." I hung up before she could ask any more questions. The decision settled upon me, heavy as a shroud. I was going to feed the beast. The back roads of the Blue Ridge Mountains are dotted with small, isolated farms, places that time seems to have forgotten. I found one about an hour away with a leaning barn and a pasture full of grazing sheep. An old farmer with hands like gnarled oak roots and suspicious eyes sold them to me. "What's a fella like you need with 30 head of sheep?" he asked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near my boot. "Starting a flock." "Something like that," I said, peeling off bills from the cash I'd withdrawn, the last of our liquid savings. "Just trying to work the land, a new project." He grunted, counting the money. "Your funeral?" "Coyotes and wolves in these mountains are something fierce. They'll pick a flock clean if you ain't careful." "I'll be careful," I said, my voice grim. It took 2 trips in my pickup, outfitted with a livestock cage I'd rented, to get all 30 sheep back to the property. I herded them into a hastily repaired corral I'd found near the barn. They milled about, bleating nervously, their simple animal minds oblivious to their purpose. They weren't livestock. They were a sacrifice. 30 lives for the 3 that mattered to me. 1 for each of the 30 nights of the lunar cycle the Codex demanded. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, I took the Codex and a length of rope and walked out onto the front lawn. I felt a strange, detached calm. I was an engineer again, following a set of technical instructions for a job that had to be done. Following the diagrams in the ancient book, I used a bag of driveway salt to draw a large, intricate circle on the grass between the house and the woods. I placed heavy candles at 5 designated points. Then I went to the corral. The sheep shied away from me, their eyes rolling. I cornered one, a young ewe, and tied the rope around its neck. It fought me as I led it to the circle, its hooves digging into the soft earth. I tied its rope to a stake I'd driven into the center of the salt-lined pattern. It stood there, trembling and bleeding pitifully into the twilight. I stood at the edge of the circle and opened the Codex to the rite of appeasement. The words were a strange, guttural chant that felt alien and wrong in my mouth. I read them aloud, my voice shaking at first, then growing stronger as I finished the passage. The air grew still and cold. The last of the crickets, which had just begun their nightly chorus, fell silent. My work was done. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked into the house, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I locked the front door, bolted it, and then went through the house, checking every window and every lock. The first tribute was delivered. All I had to do now was wait for the dawn. The first night was an exercise in pure auditory terror. I sat in the dark of the living room, a bottle of whiskey I'd found in a kitchen cabinet my only companion, and listened. For the first hour, the only sound was the frantic, terrified bleating of the ewe from the front lawn. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking sound that scraped at my already frayed nerves. Then, the bleating pitched higher into a sound of sheer panic before being abruptly cut off, as if a hand had been clapped over its mouth. Silence descended again, thick and absolute. And then, new sounds began. The sickening, wet crack of breaking bones, a sound of tearing, of sinew and muscle being ripped from a frame. It was followed by a rhythmic, greedy, wet chomping that seemed to go on for an eternity. It was the sound of a predator, utterly absorbed in its meal. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block it out. The sounds were a violation, an obscene intrusion into the quiet night. One by one, I heard the faint pop of the candles in the circle extinguishing, as if a great cold wind was passing over them. I must have passed out from fear and whiskey, because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the windows. I woke up slumped in the armchair, my neck stiff, my mouth tasting of bile. With a sense of profound dread, I forced myself to my feet and went to the window. The lawn was pristine. The salt circle was undisturbed, but the stake in the middle was bare, the rope chewed through. There was no sign of the ewe, no blood, no tufts of wool, not even a single blade of disturbed grass. It was as if the animal had simply vanished into thin air. The ground had been wiped clean. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone. Sarah answered on the first ring. "David? How are you? How's Leo?" I asked, my voice hoarse. There was a pause. "Better," she said, and I could hear the exhaustion and cautious relief in her voice. The whispering, it stopped. Sometime in the middle of the night. "Leo, he drank some water this morning. It's the first thing he's taken in 2 days." A wave of dizzying, intoxicating relief washed over me. It was working. The horror of the night, the sacrifice, it was all worth it. I had made the right choice. Arthur Martin was wrong. "Just stay there," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Stay with your sister. I have to finish what I'm doing here. It's going to take some time, but it's working." The next 29 nights blurred into a single waking nightmare. My life became a hellish, monotonous routine governed by the setting of the sun. Each evening at dusk, I would lead another sheep to the circle. Each evening, I would recite the ancient guttural words from the Codex. Each evening, I would lock myself in the house and listen to the sounds of slaughter. The sounds grew bolder, more confident with each passing night. The chomping became a ravenous, gullet-deep gorging. Sometimes, I would hear a low, guttural rumble of satisfaction that vibrated through the floorboards of the house. The entity was growing. I could feel it. The very air around the property felt heavier, charged with a predatory energy. I became a ghost in my own home. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I lost weight, and my reflection in the mirror was a stranger, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man with a permanent tremor in his hands. The only thing that kept me going were my brief daily phone calls with Sarah. Each day she reported that Leo was a little better. He was eating again, talking a little. The whispering had not returned. My family was safe. The price was my sanity, but it was a price I was willing to pay. Finally, the 30th night arrived. The last sheep. I led the animal, the final piece of my grim transaction, to the circle. Its wool was thick and white in the fading light. I tied it to the stake and turned to the Codex, my hands shaking not with fear but with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and an overwhelming sense of relief. This was it. The final payment. I recited the words of the ritual for the last time. They felt familiar on my tongue now, a hateful prayer I knew by heart. "It is finished," I whispered to the empty air when I was done. "The tribute is paid." I left the final offering and retreated into the house, locking the door behind me. I didn't even bother with the whiskey. I sat in the armchair, my body buzzing with nervous energy, and waited. I waited for the final gruesome chorus of sounds to begin, and then for the blessed permanent silence that would follow. The silence that would mean my nightmare was over and I could finally bring my family home. The final offering met its end just as the 29 before it had. The terrified bleat, the sudden, choked-off silence, and then the wet, obscene sounds of the feast. I sat in the darkness, listening, my entire body coiled like a spring. I was waiting for the silence that would follow. The true silence. The one that would signify the end of the ritual and the beginning of the creature's long sleep. But the silence never came. Instead, after the sounds of feeding stopped, a new sound began. It was a low, resonant hum, identical to the one we'd heard on our first night in the house. But this time it was 100 times louder, a deep, foundational vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock beneath the foundation. The floorboards trembled, the window panes rattled in their frames. The hum grew in intensity until the air itself felt thick and alive with energy. Then came a sound like a giant redwood tree splitting in two, a deafening crack that came from directly below me from the basement. The entire house lurched, throwing me from the armchair to the floor. Pictures fell from the walls, and a spider web of cracks raced across the plaster ceiling. I scrambled to my feet, my ears ringing, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. I didn't know how long I was out. Maybe seconds, maybe a minute. The whole house was shaking. I staggered to the window and looked out. The source of the noise, the source of everything, was becoming terrifyingly clear. A pillar of raw, crimson light erupted from the ground where the basement lay, punching a hole through the first floor and the roof of my house and stabbing upwards into the night sky. It was a silent, violent beam of pure energy, painting the undersides of the clouds a ghastly, blood red. The unholy glow illuminated the entire valley, a malevolent beacon visible for miles. The whole town could see it. My heart seized. It was a trap. It was all a trap. Feeding it doesn't make it sleep. It makes it stronger. Arthur Martin's desperate warning screamed in my head. The 30 nights of tribute weren't appeasement. They were an infusion of power. Each life I had fed it was another bar broken on its ancient cage. The rite of binding, the willing sacrifice of John Martin, hadn't been an act of murder. It had been an act of self-imprisonment, a brave soul volunteering to become the living lock on the door. And I, in my desperate, selfish love for my family, had just spent a month systematically destroying that lock. My phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the vibrating hum. It was Sarah. I fumbled for it, my hands slick with sweat. Before I could even speak, the wail of distant sirens began to echo through the mountains. People had seen the light. The sheriff, the neighbors, they were coming. "David, what is that light? My sister can see it from her porch all the way in Tennessee." Sarah's voice was filled with a new, dawning horror. "Listen to me," I screamed into the phone, my voice raw with panic. "Take Leo. Get in the car and drive. Go west. Don't stop driving. Do you understand me? As far and as fast as you can. Don't look back." Headlights appeared at the end of my long driveway, bouncing and weaving as vehicles sped toward the house. A sheriff's cruiser followed by a handful of pickup trucks. "David, what did you do?" Sarah sobbed. "I tried to save you," I choked out, and then I hung up. I burst out the front door just as the sheriff's car screeched to a halt on my lawn. 2 deputies spilled out, their guns drawn, their faces illuminated by the pulsating red light emanating from my ruined home.
"Freeze! Hands in the air!"
one of them yelled, his voice trembling. But then his command died in his throat. He and his partner froze, their eyes lifting from me to the roof of the house, their faces slack with disbelief and terror. I turned slowly, my whole body numb, and followed their gaze. There, silhouetted against the bloody crimson sky, stood the creature. But it was not the gaunt, spectral thing from the videotape or from Leo's drawings. It was transformed. The raw energy of 30 stolen lives had given it substance, had woven muscle and thick gray hide onto its skeletal frame. It was immense, easily 15 feet tall, a terrifying fusion of man and beast, radiating power and ancient malice. It threw back its wolf skull head, and from the black void of its jaws it issued a deafening, triumphant roar that shook the very mountains. It was the sound of a prisoner, freed at last. Arthur's words echoed in my memory, a final, damning chorus. "Don't feed it." I finally understood everything. The Martins had known. They were going to sacrifice one of their own to keep the world safe, and I had undone their noble, horrifying work. The deputies opened fire. The crack of their pistols was pathetic against the creature's roar. The bullets sparked off its hide like pebbles, having no effect. With a single, fluid leap, the beast launched itself from the roof, landing on the sheriff's cruiser with a deafening crunch of shattering glass and collapsing metal. It tore the roof off the car with one swipe of its 3-fingered claws and dragged the screaming deputy out. Panic erupted. The neighbors who had come to investigate were screaming, scrambling back to their trucks. I didn't wait to see more. I sprinted to my own pickup, my mind a blank slate of pure animal terror. I jumped in, cranked the engine, and stomped on the gas. My truck fishtailed on the lawn, tires tearing up the grass where I had performed my nightly rituals. In my rearview mirror, a scene from hell unfolded. The freed hunger spirit, the ancient evil I had nourished and unleashed, was beginning its harvest. I saw it toss a grown man through the air like a rag doll. I saw it descend upon the terrified knot of people, a blur of gray skin and flashing claws. I sped down the mountain road, away from the screams, away from the crimson glow, away from the home I had bought, and the monster I had set free. I had saved my family for now, but as I drove into the night, leaving a massacre behind me, I knew the horrifying truth of my bargain. I had bought my wife and son one more month of life, but in doing so I had just condemned the world,